On Christmas Day 1991, an event occurred that redrew the map of the world and ended an era. The Soviet Union, one of the two global superpowers that had dominated international politics for nearly half a century, simply ceased to exist. For decades, the world had lived under the shadow of the Cold War, a tense standoff between the Communist East, led by the Soviet Union, and the capitalist West, led by the United States. The collapse of the USSR was not just the end of a country, it was the end of a global ideological battle. It signaled a victory for Western democracy and capitalism, and it unleashed a wave of change that is still being felt today, right up to our current date of June 23, 2025. Understanding why this colossal state crumbled is essential to understanding the world we now inhabit. The fall of the Soviet Union was not caused by a single event, but by a perfect storm of long-term problems and short-term triggers. Imagine a massive old building with a weak foundation, rotting beams and cracked walls. For years it might remain standing, looking imposing from the outside. But then, a series of storms, one after another, batters the structure until it can no longer hold its own weight. This is what happened to the Soviet Union. Decades of economic mismanagement, costly military adventures, and political repression had weakened it from within. When a new leader tried to make repairs, his efforts inadvertently brought the whole structure crashing down, changing the course of history forever. This was a moment that reshaped continents and redefined international power. 50 new countries emerged from the ruins of the Soviet Empire, from Ukraine and Belarus in Europe to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in Central Asia. The rigid division of Europe, symbolized by the Iron Curtain, vanished almost overnight. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower, a position that brought its own set of challenges and responsibilities. For millions of people who had lived their entire lives under communist rule, it was a time of immense uncertainty, but also incredible hope for a new, freer future. The story of the Soviet collapse is a powerful lesson in how even the mightiest empires can fall. The global impact was immediate and profound. Alliances that had defined the Cold War, like the Warsaw Pact, which bound Eastern European nations to Moscow, dissolved. Conflicts that had been frozen by the superpower rivalry thawed, sometimes with tragic consequences, as seen in places like the former Yugoslavia. At the same time, new opportunities for international cooperation opened up. The threat of a global nuclear war between Moscow and Washington, a fear that had haunted generations, receded dramatically. The story of why the Soviet Union collapsed is a complex tapestry woven from many different threads, each one contributing to the final unraveling of a once mighty empire that held the world in its grip. At the heart of the Soviet Union's problems was its economy. The system was based on central planning, where the government in Moscow decided everything. They decided what factories should produce, how much they should make, and what price to sell it for. This system was incredibly inefficient and created massive problems. It completely ignored what ordinary people actually wanted or needed. Because there was no competition or profit motive to encourage innovation, factories often produced low-quality goods that nobody wanted to buy. This led to chronic shortages of basic necessities, from toilet paper and soap to shoes and food, forcing citizens to wait in incredibly long lines for hours, often for very little. This economic weakness was made much worse by the arms race with the United States. During the Cold War, both superpowers spent astronomical sums of money building up vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, tanks, planes, and ships. For the much larger and more dynamic American economy, this was a heavy burden. For the smaller, inefficient Soviet economy, it was absolutely crippling. A huge portion of the country's resources, scientific talent, and industrial might was diverted to the military. This meant there was even less left over to produce consumer goods or invest in things like modern farming equipment or better housing, making life for the average Soviet citizen even more difficult and frustrating. Then came the war in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded its southern neighbor to support a struggling communist government. Moscow expected a quick and easy victory, but instead they found themselves bogged down in a brutal decade-long conflict. The Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, were supplied with weapons by the United States and other countries. They waged a fierce guerrilla war that the massive Soviet army could not win. The war became known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It was a huge drain on the already struggling economy, costing billions of rubles and diverting resources that were desperately needed back home. The war had a devastating human and psychological cost as well. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and many more came home wounded. both physically and mentally. For the first time, Soviet people began to openly question the government's decisions. Stories of the brutal reality of the war filtered back home, undermining the official state propaganda that claimed everything was going right. Conflict shattered the myth of the invincible Red Army and created a deep sense of disillusionment and cynicism among the population. This loss of faith in the government, combined with the immense economic strain, was a critical factor that pushed the Soviet system closer to its breaking point. In 1985, a new, younger leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He recognized that the Soviet Union was in deep trouble and that things had to change if it were to survive. Gorbachev was a dedicated communist, but he believed the system could be fixed. To save it, he introduced two radical new policies, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, which means restructuring, was a plan to reform the failing Soviet economy. It allowed for some small-scale private businesses like opening a restaurant or a repair shop, and gave factory managers more control over their operations instead of just following orders from Moscow. The goal was to make the economy more efficient and productive. The second policy was glasnost, which means openness. For decades, the Soviet government had controlled everything people could see, read, or say. There was no freedom of speech or freedom of the press. Glasnost changed that. Gorbachev relaxed censorship, allowing newspapers and television to report on the country's problems for the first time. People were allowed to criticize the government and discuss history honestly, including the dark chapters of Stalin's rule. Gorbachev hoped that this new openness would energize the people and get them to support his economic reforms, creating a more dynamic and modern form of socialism. However, these reforms had explosive and unintended consequences. They did not work as Gorbachev had planned. Perestroika ended up creating economic chaos. The old system of central planning was dismantled before a new, functioning market system could be put in place. This led to even worse shortages, rising prices, and economic instability. Instead of making things better, the reforms made daily life harder for many people, which caused them to lose faith in Gorbachev's leadership. The economic restructuring was too little, too late, and it only highlighted how broken the underlying system truly was, fueling widespread public discontent. Meanwhile, glasnost opened a Pandora's box of problems that the Soviet state could no longer control. The newfound freedom of speech allowed long-suppressed frustrations to pour out into the open. People didn't just criticize the economy, they began to question the entire communist system. One of the most powerful forces unleashed by glasnost was nationalism. For decades, the Soviet Union had used force and propaganda to suppress the identities of the many different ethnic groups living within its borders, from Lithuanians and Estonians in the west to Georgians and Armenians in the south. Suddenly, these groups could openly demand more autonomy and even complete independence. The rise of nationalism was, honestly, perhaps the single most powerful force that tore the Soviet Union apart. You see, the USSR was not just one country, but a vast empire made up of 15 nominally separate republics, each with its own language, culture, and history. Thanks to these republics were able to rediscover their national identities and, for the first time in decades, air their historical grievances against Russian dominance from Moscow. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which had been forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II, were the first to lead the charge. They used their new freedoms to organize mass demonstrations and declare their intention to leave the Union, inspiring others to follow their example. This wave of nationalism was, if anything, supercharged by events in Eastern Europe. For over 40 years, countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany had been Soviet satellite states, ruled by communist governments loyal to Moscow. In 1989, in a truly stunning turn of events, Gorbachev made it clear that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to keep these governments in power. This led to a series of mostly peaceful revolutions across Eastern Europe. The most iconic moment, of course, came in November 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, a powerful symbol of Cold War division. Watching these countries break free from Moscow's control sent a clear message to the republics inside the USSR. Independence was now possible. As the Union weakened, a political rival to Gorbachev emerged in Russia, the largest and most powerful republic, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a charismatic and populist politician who had actually been pushed out of the Communist Party leadership by Gorbachev. He reinvented himself as a Democrat and a Russian nationalist. In June 1991, he became the first ever democratically elected president of Russia. Yeltsin used his position to challenge Gorbachev's authority and champion the cause of Russian sovereignty, arguing that Russia itself would be better off without having to support the other poorer republics. His growing popularity made him a powerful alternative leader to the increasingly isolated Gorbachev. The breaking point came in August 1991. Fearing that Gorbachev was about to sign a new treaty that would give the republics much more power and, well, effectively dissolve the Soviet Union, a group of hardline communist officials launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and sent tanks into the streets of Moscow to seize control. But the coup was poorly organized and met with massive public resistance, led by Boris Yeltsin. In a defining image of the era, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called on the people to resist the plotters. The coup collapsed in just 3 days. It was a spectacular failure that, in the end, fatally wounded the authority of Gorbachev and the Communist Party. The failed August coup was really the final nail in the coffin for the Soviet Union. Although Gorbachev was restored to power, his authority was without a doubt shattered. The real hero of the moment was Boris Yeltsin, who had stood up to the hardliners and defended democracy. After the coup, power shifted decisively from Gorbachev and the Central Soviet government to Yeltsin and the leaders of the individual republics. One by one, the republics, including the crucial nation of Ukraine, declared their complete independence. They saw no future in a union whose own leaders had tried to turn back the clock with military force. The central government in Moscow was now powerless, really just an empty shell with no authority. The collapse wasn't caused by just one single factor, but by the convergence of all these pressures at once. The long-term weakness of the centrally planned economy created a foundation of public discontent. The hugely expensive arms race and the disastrous war in Afghanistan bled the country of money and morale, exposing the system's flaws. When Gorbachev tried to fix these problems with and his reforms, honestly inadvertently made things worse, caused economic chaos, while unleashed powerful nationalist sentiments that the state could no longer contain, all while the inspiration of a free Eastern Europe loomed large. This created a kind of domino effect. The weak economy fueled calls for reform. The reforms unleashed nationalism. The rise of nationalism prompted the hardline coup. The failure of the coup destroyed the authority of the central government and propelled Boris Yeltsin to the forefront. In December 1991, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus. Together, they formally declared that the Soviet Union was dissolved and created a new, much looser alliance called the Commonwealth of Independent States. Left with no country to rule, Mikhail Gorbachev had no choice but to resign. On December 25, 1991, the red Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed because it could no longer deliver on its promises to its people, it could no longer afford its military ambitions, and it could no longer contain the desire of its diverse peoples for freedom and national identity. It wasn't defeated in a great war, but rather crumbled from within, weighed down by its own internal contradictions. The combined forces of economic failure, costly overreach, flawed reforms, and the unstoppable power of nationalism proved to be just too much for the once mighty superpower to withstand. The story of its fall remains one of the most dramatic and important chapters of modern history, a lesson in how quickly the world can change.